Right, in the last video clip, I talked about the distinction between abstract and concrete labour, and I said I would talk about the distinction between labour power and labour. This distinction is probably the most distinctive feature of Marx's economic theory as opposed to all other writers. Thomas Piketty, in fact, in his book on Capital in the 21st Century, talks about labour power being bought and sold. Although Piketty says he's not a Marxist, but almost all other economic theorists just talk about labour, both as the thing that you buy and sell, and as the activities that you do. And Marx points out that this is wrong. You don't sell the activity that you do. Your selling of labour power, which is making an employment contract with a boss, takes place before the labour. You sell your labour power precisely because you're not in a position to do the labour yourself and then sell it, which means sell the product of it, because you don't have access to the means of production to do that. Once you have sold your labour power, labour is the process by which the person who's bought it, the capitalist, uses or consumes your labour power. Your labour power is your creative, productive ability. Labour is the way that the capitalist uses it. And it's not just there's a distinction between them, there is an opposition between them. Labour drains, uses, abuses, alienates labour power. They're quite distinct things. That distinction is important for Marx's discussion about how labour changes and develops and changes all the time in a capitalist economy. It's also important, and it's the pivot of his theory of profit. And the theory says, it's very simple. It says, you're producing apples, you sign on to work in the apple orchard or the fruit packing factory. You sell your labour power as any other commodity is sold, but on a price which is regulated very approximately, and Marx never says it's any other than very approximately. In fact, he says that price will diverge from value systematically very often, but is governed in the last instance by the value of that commodity labour power. The value of the commodity is the labour time embodied in it, the labour time represented socially in it. The labour time represented socially in labour power is the labour time used for the subsistence of the working class. That's the term Marx used. Today we would say a living wage. Doesn't mean that every worker gets a living wage. It means that that's a baseline for wages, to which additional amounts may be added because more labour time is involved in that labour power because it requires special training or for other reasons. But that's what determines what is paid for labour power. What about the new value you produce by your work in the apple orchard? That's determined by the hours of work you put in, assuming, of course, that these hours can be counted as a use of the general social pool of labour power, which means it's what Marx calls socially average labour time. You do it at the average level of intensity, productivity, and so on. And that figures could be completely different. In fact, it is guaranteed by the history of centuries and thousands of years before capitalism that it will be greater than the value of labour power. That is, that for over centuries and thousands of years before capitalism, the productivity of labour is increased, more is produced in an hour, different systems are put in place for extracting the surplus of what the worker produces over what the worker receives, and capitalism starts off from that point and intensifies it, develops it, increases the productivity of labour even further. And so capitalism produces a new system of extraction of the surplus produced over the payment for labour. But the difference with capitalism is that in capitalism it takes place not by slavery, not by serfdom, not by a politically constructed system, but through the workings of a market in which formally everybody takes part as an equal participant, freely and in possession of their, just dealing with their own property. So that's Marx's theory of profit. It arises from the fact that you sell your labour power for whatever pittance is the living wage. What you produce depends on the technology that capitalism has developed. It is much greater than the value paid to you, and that extra appears as the property of the capitalist.